Hello, I'm Stefan, and welcome to another episode of Japan at War. Last time we covered the preparations being made by Naval Commander Yi Sun-shin. Konishi was on the march to Seoul, and the Koreans actually had a pretty good idea of the route the Japanese would be taking. Because of how mountainous Korea is, the Japanese would be confined to specific prepared routes that went through the valleys that crisscross the peninsula. There were three routes linking Busan and Seoul: the eastern route through Gyeongsang, the western route through Chungcheong, and the most direct route straight up the middle. With these three routes in mind, they devised this plan. General Yi Il, the provincial commander for Gyeongsang, would head south along the central road to stop the Japanese advance while it was still in southern Gyeongsang. General Sin-ip, the commander of three provinces and Yi Il's superior, would position his men further north on the central road in the town of Sangju to face the Japanese if they managed to get by Yi Il. The country commanders, in the meantime, would fan out across the south to hold strategic posts. Their commander-in-chief, a 58-year-old civil servant named Kim Myung-won, would remain in Seoul to oversee defensive preparations there. All these generals would have a hard time mustering high-quality troops to lead south, though. The military list of enlisted men in and around the capitals was useless. Many of them were absent, excused because of illness, or excused due to the pre-described 2-year mourning period for a deceased parent. To give you an example of the poor state of the troops that they could raise, the company of 4,000 troops assigned to Yi Il was mostly students and clerks pulled from government office, and not all of them warriors. With orders to depart immediately, General Yi Il left with this ragtag army and 60 mounted warriors. Which, to me, sounds crazy. Not only was this army numerically inferior, but also unskilled. How could anyone think that this would be enough? The situation was only marginally better for Yi's superior, Sin-ip, who heads south from Seoul the following day. King Sangju was there to see him off, along with a large group of the capital's civilians. In a brief ceremony, the king gave Sin-ip an old sword representing his military authority. And with that, the king also gave him personal permission to call any men in the provinces to form an army, to take any weapon that they needed from the armories, and to execute anyone who failed to obey his commands. The king and the people of Seoul expected a lot from him. But remember, this was the same man that said that even if the Japanese had firelocks, that they couldn't hit anyone with them. Now that they were at war, he continued to talk the same way. He claimed that the Japanese were outrunning their supply lines, and each day grew more vulnerable to cavalry charges. He vowed to stop them in their tracks or not come back alive. This is some pretty big talk, and it was probably very comforting to anyone that heard him talk. While General Sin was setting out south, Kato's second contingent of 22,000 men was landing in Busan. After waiting for favorable winds, they finally made their crossing from Tsushima Island on May 28th, 5 days behind Konishi Yukinaga. As Kato Kiyomasa and his men made their way to shore, he would have been looking for any signs of Konishi and his men. Kato was shocked. Konishi was gone. He was furious. Konishi taking Seoul was a level of glory hogging that he just wouldn't be able to tolerate. He gathered his forces, pulled out, and set his men on a punishing pace along his pre-assigned eastern route. He stormed through Yangsang first, encountering no resistance, then went on to Ongyang. At Gyeongju, he smashed through the hastily assembled forces torched all the buildings and put 3,000 people to the sword, then onwards to Yongchang, Sinyan, and finally at Andong. His men had to have been worn out, but Kato would not rest. He continued to push his men, marching day and night. He would not stop until he had caught up to his rival, Konishi Yukinaga. Kuroda Nagamasa's third contingent arrived next from Tsushima. They arrived at the port of Angulpo on May 29th. Being only 23 and younger than both Kato and Konishi, he didn't really participate in the rivalry between the two. He came to Korea expecting glory, but not really the largest portion of it. He was a lot more modest and, honestly, a lot more realistic. After completing his landing and taking the nearby fort of Kimhae, killing a little over 1,000 men in the process, Kuroda went north by his pre-assigned route up the western side. It would take him through Changyong, Sangju, Cheongju, Suwon, and then to the Han River, and then Seoul. There were now 3 armies en route to the capital. On June 2nd, General Yi and his 4,000 men passed through Choryong Pass and ascended to the town of Sangju in northern Gyeongsang. He tried to recruit men, but found no real soldiers there. They had already been called to defend the provincial capital of Daegu. In a desperate bid to increase the size of his forces, he actually threatened a local minister of Sangju into helping him recruit more men. If he refused, he would have the man beheaded for treason. He then used grain from the government storehouse to hire peasants, bringing the total close to 5,000, maybe even 6,000. Honestly, though, he had to know that these men wouldn't be enough, especially not having the right skills. His excuse was that he figured that he had at least a week to train them before the enemy arrived, though. He had one day. Konishi Yukinaga had already taken Daegu and was nearing Sonsan, just a few kilometers to the southeast. When a locally recruited peasant soldier told him of this news, the general refused to believe him and had the man killed for spreading rumors. He just couldn't believe an army could fight all the way from Busan to Sonsan in just 10 days. The reports must have kept coming though, because on June 3rd, Yi deployed his force on the slopes behind Sangju and prepared for battle. He sat at the head of his army in fine armor, his flag raised high. In front of him to the south was a small river and a heavy cover of forest, and beyond that was Sangju. Konishi's contingent now split into 2 groups, 10,000 men under Konishi and Matsura Shigenobu, headed straight for the town, and they took it without a fight. The remaining force of around 6,700 men under So Yoshitoshi swung north and then left, avoiding Sangju, and would strike directly at Yi's army, which their scouts told them was waiting for them on the hill behind the town. So's men approached the Korean forces through the forest. Their scouts led the way, emerging from the trees in full view of the Koreans, but well beyond the range of their bows. Yi's officers saw all this, but couldn't bring themselves to tell him. I mean, they had just seen a man beheaded for telling him things he wasn't ready to accept. They didn't want to be accused of spreading rumors. Then smoke was seen rising beyond the trees in the direction of the town of Sangju. Yi didn't know it yet, but the town had already fallen. He ordered one of his officers to investigate, and as the man neared the bridge to cross the river, a shot broke the silence. The officer fell off his horse, and an Ashiguru foot soldier ran from under the bridge and cut his head off. Immediately after that, a mass of Japanese soldiers appeared from the forest and then formed up into 3 groups. the units began to advance in a wide, imposing arc. Matchlock men in the front with spears and swords, bringing up the rear. When the distance was only about 100 meters from the enemy, the Ashiguru opened fire into the Koreans. They opened up a volley and then advanced a couple meters. Then volley, advance, until there was only 50 meters from each other. Yi's poor men struggled to return fire with their bows, but most just barely knew how to use them. The air was nothing but smoke and cries of pain and death, and it was just too much for the tradesmen and farmers that made up a sizable part of Yi's army. They threw down their weapons and started a panicked retreat. It was the signal that the spear and swordsmen of the Japanese had been waiting for, to push forward and finish them off. Within minutes, Yi's army was reduced to heaps of headless corpses, and the fields were stained red. And that is where we will end this episode. Terror continues, and now 2 Japanese armies are rushing forward to take Seoul. When will their advance be halted? And what happened to General Yi? Find out on the next episode. See you then.